January 18th, 1943, 0:47 hours, Tunisia, North Africa. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain near Bou Arada when Lieutenant John Foote of the 72nd Anti-Tank Regiment, Royal Artillery, first saw it through his binoculars. A massive grey shape emerging from the dust, its angular hull catching the light like some prehistoric beast. The Tiger of Germany's most feared weapon. 56 tons of Krupp steel, armed with the legendary 80 mm gun that could punch through any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. Foote's hands trembled slightly as he lowered the binoculars. His gun, a new 17-pounder anti-tank gun that had arrived just 3 weeks earlier, had never been fired in anger. The British crews manning these weapons had been told they were a match for the Tiger, told they could penetrate its armour, told they could stop the unstoppable. They were about to find out if any of it was true. The Tiger commander, Hauptmann Otto Carius of Schwerpanzerabteilung 501, surveyed the British positions with the confidence of a man who had never been defeated. His Tiger had survived every engagement since arriving in Tunisia in November 1942. British 2-pounders bounced off like pebbles. American 37mm guns were jokes. Even the 6-pounder, the best anti-tank gun the Allies had fielded until now, could barely scratch the Tiger's frontal armour. Carius had developed a contempt for Allied anti-tank capabilities that bordered on arrogance. What he didn't know, what German intelligence had failed to report, was that the rules of armoured warfare were about to change. The 17-pounder anti-tank gun represented the first Allied weapon capable of defeating the Tiger on equal terms. Within minutes, the psychological dominance German armour had enjoyed for nearly 4 years would shatter. This is the story of how British engineering answered German invincibility, how a single weapon system transformed armoured warfare, and how the myth of the Tiger's invulnerability died on a dusty Tunisian hillside. The Tiger Eye had emerged from a November 1941 panic similar to the one that spawned the P-47 Thunderbolt. When German forces encountered Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks on the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht discovered that their Panzer IIIs and IVs were completely outmatched. The 50mm and 75mm guns then in service couldn't reliably penetrate Soviet armour, while Soviet guns destroyed German tanks with ease. Hitler personally demanded a heavy tank that could dominate any battlefield. The result was the Panzerkampfwagen 6, Tiger Ausf E, or simply the Tiger Eye. At 56 tons, it was the heaviest production tank in the world when it entered service in August 1942. The armour was unprecedented, 100 mm on the frontal hull, 80 mm on the sides, all at vertical angles that maximised effective thickness. But the real terror was the gun. The ATPM 36 L50 was derived from the legendary 80 cm flak gun that had devastated Allied tanks in North Africa. With a muzzle velocity of 2,657 feet per second firing armour-piercing ammunition, it could penetrate 120 mm of armour at 1,000 yards. No Allied tank had armour even close to that thickness. The Tiger's combat debut in September 1942 near Leningrad had been inauspicious, with mechanical problems and poor terrain limiting its effectiveness. But by early 1943, German crews had learned to employ it properly. The Tiger wasn't meant to brawl at close range. It was a long-range sniper, using its superior optics and powerful gun to destroy enemy tanks before they could even return fire. In Tunisia, Tigers had become the stuff of nightmares for Allied tankers. Lieutenant Colonel William Watson of the 17th to 21st Lancers later recalled the first time his unit encountered Tigers near Taburba in December 1942. We had Shermans, good tanks, reliable, well armed with 75mm guns. We outnumbered the Germans 3-1. It didn't matter. The Tigers engaged us at ranges where our shells fell short. We watched our rounds bounce off their armour like tennis balls. They destroyed 11 of our tanks in 6 minutes. The survivors retreated. There was nothing else we could do. The psychological effect was devastating. Allied tank crews began to develop what medical officers called Tiger fever, a form of combat stress that manifested when Tigers were reported in the area. Crews would abandon serviceable tanks rather than face the German heavies. Some units refused to advance if Tigers were suspected to be present. British intelligence estimated that a single Tiger was tactically equivalent to 5 Shermans or 7 Cromwells. The problem wasn't just the Tiger's capabilities, It was that the British had nothing that could stop it. The standard 6-pounder anti-tank gun firing a 57mm shell could penetrate 74mm of armour at 1,000 yards under ideal conditions. Against the Tiger's 100mm frontal plate, it was useless beyond 500 yards, and even at that range penetration was uncertain. Tank guns were equally impotent. The Sherman 75mm gun could penetrate only 68mm at 1,000 yards. The Cromwell's 75mm was marginally better. The Churchill's 6-pounder was no improvement. British tanks had to close to suicidal ranges to have any chance of penetrating a Tiger, and in doing so, they exposed themselves to certain destruction. The situation was strategically intolerable. Germany was producing Tigers at a rate of about 25 per month. Not many by production standards, but each Tiger tied down dozens of Allied tanks. If the Germans could field enough Tigers, they could stall the Allied advance indefinitely. The British Ordnance Board had been working on a solution since 1941, but bureaucratic delays and manufacturing challenges had slowed development. The answer was the Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder, a weapon that would prove to be the finest anti-tank gun of World War II. The 17-pounder fired a 76.2mm shell, but calling it simply a 76mm gun understates its capabilities. The secret was in the ammunition. The standard, armour-piercing capped ballistic cap round weighed 17 pounds, hence the name, and left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second. This combination of mass and velocity gave it penetration characteristics that exceeded anything else in Western Allied service. At 1,000 yards, the 17-pounder could penetrate 130 metres of armour. That meant it could defeat the Tiger's frontal armour at any practical engagement range. More importantly, it could penetrate the Tiger's side armour at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, matching the German gun's effective range. But the 17-pounder had been plagued with problems. The gun was large and heavy, weighing over 3 tons in its field carriage form. It required a substantial towing vehicle and a trained crew of 7 men to operate effectively. The recoil was tremendous, often throwing the gun backwards several feet even with the spades dug in. Early ammunition had reliability problems with shells failing to penetrate despite hitting squarely. Worst of all, production had been painfully slow. British industry, stretched to the breaking point producing everything from aircraft to artillery shells, struggled to manufacture the complex gun in quantity. By January 1943, fewer than 100 guns had been delivered to field units. Most were still in England, held back for the expected defence against German invasion. Only a handful had made it to North Africa, arriving with minimal ammunition and crews that had barely trained on the weapon. Lieutenant John Foot's gun was one of 6 17-pounders that had reached Tunisia in December 1942. His crew had fired exactly 8 practice rounds before being declared operational. None had hit a moving target. None had been fired at ranges beyond 800 yards. They had never seen a Tiger except in photographs. Now, on this January morning, they were about to face one in combat. Foot watched the Tiger approach through his binoculars. It was moving slowly, perhaps 10 miles per hour, buttoned up with all hatches closed. The commander's cupola rotated slowly as the crew scanned for threats. The 80mm gun traversed left and right, searching for targets. Behind it, 2 Panzer IVs followed at intervals, supporting the heavy tank. The British position was well chosen. Foot's 17-pounder sat in a shallow depression between 2 rocky outcrops, camouflaged with netting and local vegetation. The gun had a clear field of fire across 200 yards of open ground. The Tiger would have to cross this killing zone to reach the British infantry positions beyond. Sergeant Bill Harris, the gunlayer responsible for aiming and firing, checked his sight picture one more time. The range was estimated at 400 yards, well within the 17-pounder's capabilities according to the technical manual, but technical manuals don't account for combat stress, for the reality of facing a machine that had achieved mythical status among Allied troops. "Target tank," Foot called out, his voice surprisingly steady. "Range 1400, load armour, piercing." The loader, Private James Mackenzie, grabbed one of the precious 17-pound shells. They had only 20 rounds and no prospect of resupply for at least a week. Every shot had to count. The shell slid into the breech with a solid metallic clunk. The breech closed with a sound like a bank vault. The Tiger was some 200 yards away now, still approaching. Carius, in the Tiger's commander position, was scanning the hillside through his scissors periscope. He had learned to read terrain, to spot the telltale signs of anti-tank positions. The rocky outcrops ahead looked suspicious. Good hull-down positions, probably British 6-pounders hiding there. He'd dealt with those before. The procedure was simple. Stop at maximum range, acquire the target through the excellent Zeiss optics, and methodically destroy each position with high explosive shells. The 80-obsolescence gun could reach out to 3,000 yards with acceptable accuracy. British 6-pounders had to be within 500 yards to be dangerous. It wasn't even a fair fight. He ordered his gunner to prepare to engage the suspicious positions. The Tiger's turret began to traverse, the 88mm gun elevating slightly. At 100 yards, Foote made his decision. The range was closing, but waiting longer risked the Tiger spotting his position and firing first. At this range, the 80mm shell would go through his gun shield like it wasn't there, killing his entire crew in an instant. "Fire when ready," he ordered. Harris made a final adjustment, placing the crosshairs on the Tiger's frontal hull just below the turret ring. He squeezed the trigger. The 17-pounder fired with a crack that echoed across the valley. The recoil was enormous, slamming the gun backwards nearly 5 feet despite the spades being dug in. The muzzle blast raised a cloud of dust that obscured the target for several seconds. When the dust cleared, Foote stared in disbelief. The Tiger was still moving. The shell had struck high, hitting the turret front at an angle and glancing off. He could see the bright scar on the armour where the shell had impacted, but there was no penetration. Inside the Tiger, the crew had experienced a different kind of shock. The impact had rung through the tank like a massive bell, stunning everyone momentarily. Carius had heard many shells hit his Tiger before, but nothing like this. The sound was different, heavier, more violent. This wasn't a 6-pounder. That was at least a 75, his gunner reported, shaken. Maybe bigger. Carius felt a tremor of concern. If the British had brought up 75mm guns, they might actually be able to hurt him. He needed to locate and destroy this gun immediately. Target, anti-tank gun, 11 o'clock, range 1200, he called out. The gunner acquired the target, the British position now revealed by the muzzle flash and dust cloud. At 100 yards, the 80mm mustard gun couldn't miss. Foote saw the Tiger's turret swing toward his position. He knew what was coming. "Reload! Quickly!" Mackenzie was already moving, another shell in his hands. But the breech was still hot, smoking, the shell case not yet ejected. Precious seconds ticked by. The Tiger's gun steadied, pointing directly at them. Harris didn't wait for orders. As soon as the breech closed on the second shell, he fired. This time his aim was perfect. The 17-pound armour-piercing shell struck the Tiger's hull front slightly left of centre, at a nearly perpendicular angle. At 2900 feet per second, the hardened steel penetrator punched through 100mm of armour plate like a drill through wood. The shell didn't explode. Armour-piercing rounds of this era were solid shot, relying on kinetic energy rather than explosives. But the shell itself, now fragmented, and the spray of armour spalling torn from the inside of the hull plate, ricocheted through the Tiger's interior at supersonic speed. The driver, Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt, died instantly as fragments tore through his position. The radio operator beside him was struck by spalling that severed his right arm. The shell fragments continued rearward, puncturing the fuel tanks and starting a fire. Carius felt the impact through the hull, heard the screams of his crewmen, saw flames beginning to spread in the fighting compartment. Years of training took over. "Bail out, now!" The surviving crew members didn't need to be told twice. The loader opened his hatch and scrambled out. The gunner followed. Carius grabbed the wounded radio operator and pulled him toward the commander's hatch as flames licked higher. The Tiger, its driver dead, slowed and stopped, burning. The crew that had thought themselves invincible had been defeated by a weapon they didn't know existed. The 2 Panzer SEALs behind the Tiger, witnessing their supposedly invulnerable leader destroyed in seconds, immediately reversed and retreated at maximum speed. They wanted no part of whatever gun had just killed a Tiger. At the British position, Foote's crew sat in stunned silence for several seconds. Then Sergeant Harris let out a whoop that could be heard across the valley. "We got him! We bloody got him!" The implications of that single shot rippled across North Africa with astonishing speed. Within hours, every British unit in Tunisia knew that the Tiger could be killed. Within days, the story had reached Allied headquarters in Algiers. Within weeks, it was being discussed in London and Washington. The invincible German heavy tank was vulnerable after all. But more than the strategic implications, that engagement near Buarada changed the tactical calculus of armoured warfare. For the first time, Allied forces had a weapon that could engage German heavy armour on equal terms. Gun crews that had felt helpless against Tigers now had hope. British General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied ground forces in Tunisia, immediately prioritised 17-pounder delivery. Production was accelerated. Guns that had been held in England for defence were rushed to North Africa. By March 1943, the 72nd Anti-Tank Regiment had 16 guns. By May, when the Tunisia campaign ended, over 60 were in theatre. The Germans noticed. Intelligence reports from captured British documents revealed the 17-pounder's capabilities. Interrogations of captured crews provided technical details. Most disturbingly for German commanders, battlefield reports confirmed that Tigers were being destroyed at ranges previously thought safe. Hauptmann Otto Carius survived his encounter, though his radio operator lost his arm and his driver was buried in Tunisia. Carius would return to combat in a new Tiger, eventually becoming one of Germany's most successful tank commanders, with over 150 kills. But he never again assumed his tank was invulnerable. In a 1960 interview, he reflected on that January morning. The psychological impact was greater than the physical damage. We had believed the Tiger made us untouchable. One shot destroyed that belief. After Tunisia, every time we faced British positions, we had to assume they had the gun that could kill us. It changed everything. We became cautious. Cautious tankers don't win battles. The 17-pounder's development had been a story of bureaucratic frustration and technical challenges. Work had begun in late 1941 when British intelligence confirmed that Germany was developing heavy tanks. The Ordnance Board knew the existing 6-pounder, just entering service, would be inadequate against tanks with 80 mm or more of armour. The design parameters were clear. The new gun needed to penetrate at least 120 pieces of armour at 1,000 yards to ensure effectiveness against whatever the Germans were developing. This required a substantial increase in both projectile mass and muzzle velocity. The solution was to scale up the successful 6-pounder design to 3 inches, or 76.2 mm, while increasing the cartridge case size to hold more propellant. The resulting gun was a monster. The barrel alone was 14 feet long, and the entire weapon system weighed 368 pounds in its field mounting. The recoil mechanism had to be completely redesigned to handle forces that would have torn apart a conventional system. The ammunition presented its own challenges. The 17-pound projectile required new manufacturing techniques. The propellant load was massive, requiring careful quality control to prevent catastrophic breech failures. Early test firings revealed problems with projectile stability at high velocities, requiring redesigned driving bands. Production delays were maddening. The gun required specialised manufacturing equipment that British industry already operating at capacity struggled to provide. Quality control issues led to rejected components that had to be scrapped. Worker training took time. The first production guns didn't leave the factory until March 1942, 6 months behind schedule. Then came the question of how to employ the weapon. The field-mounting version, designated the 17-pounder Mark VI on carriage Mark VI, was effective but cumbersome. Positioning the gun required substantial earthworks. The crew was exposed to counter-battery fire. Mobility was limited. The obvious solution was to mount the gun in a tank, creating a mobile platform that could manoeuvre with armoured formations. But British tank design hadn't anticipated such a large gun. The Churchill, the heaviest British tank in production, couldn't accommodate the 17-pounder without a complete turret redesign. The Cromwell, faster but lighter, had the same problem. The only tank that could mount the gun with minimal modification was the American Sherman. The resulting hybrid, called the Sherman Firefly, would become one of the most feared Allied tanks of the war. But Firefly production didn't begin until early 1944, leaving a gap where the 17-pounder existed only as a towed anti-tank gun. This limitation meant that the 17-pounder had to be employed defensively, positioned in carefully chosen locations to create killing zones that German armour would have to cross. Offensive operations were problematic because the guns couldn't advance quickly with the infantry. The towed 17-pounder's finest hour came during the Italian campaign in 1943 and 1944. At Salerno in September 1943, 17-pounders of the 64th Anti-Tank Regiment engaged Tigeries of Schwer Panzerabteilung 504 at ranges exceeding 1,800 yards, destroying 3 Tigers and damaging 2 more in a single engagement. The Germans, accustomed to closing to within 1,000 yards before engaging Allied tanks, were shocked to find themselves under effective fire at distances they considered safe. At Anzio in January 1944, the story repeated. German counterattacks spearheaded by Tigers ran into prepared British positions anchored by 17-pounders. The results were catastrophic for the Germans. Unit diaries from Panzerabteilung 504 record the frustration of Tiger commanders discovering that their tactical advantage had evaporated. One entry from February 1944 reads, "The enemy has deployed a new anti-tank gun of approximately 76 Tonne caliber with extraordinary penetrating power. Tigers engaging at normal combat ranges are being destroyed. Casualties are unsustainable. Request immediate tactical guidance." German tactical guidance was to avoid the 17-pounders whenever possible, hardly a solution. The problem was that it was often impossible to determine if a position contained 6-pounders or 17-pounders until after being shot at. The guns looked similar from a distance, and both used similar camouflage and positioning tactics. By the time a Tiger identified a 17-pounder by being hit by one, it was often too late. But the 17-pounder wasn't perfect. The gun's size and weight made it difficult to conceal and hard to move. Repositioning under fire was nearly impossible. The large muzzle flash and dust cloud generated by firing revealed the position instantly, making it vulnerable to counter-battery fire from German artillery or direct fire from supporting tanks. The ammunition was also a limitation. Each shell weighed 17 pounds and the cartridge case added another 12 pounds. A full combat load of 20 rounds weighed nearly 600 pounds, requiring substantial physical effort to move and position. Gun crews were exhausted after an engagement simply from handling ammunition. Worse, ammunition production never quite caught up with demand. Guns in the field were frequently limited to 15 or fewer rounds, making every shot precious. Crews developed a dark humour about their situation. We have the gun that can kill Tigers. Now if only we had more than 10 chances to do it. The real transformation came with the Sherman Firefly, which mated the 17-pounder to the Sherman tank's chassis. British engineers had begun work on this conversion in late 1943, recognising that mobility was essential for offensive operations. The challenge was substantial. The 17-pounder was significantly larger than the Sherman standard 75mm gun. The turret had to be modified, the gun mounting redesigned, and the recoil system adapted to the confined space. The result was ungainly but effective. The Firefly's long barrel gave it a distinctive profile that German tank commanders learned to recognise and prioritise. Tiger and Panther commanders were instructed to destroy Fireflies first in any engagement, even before other tanks. This made Firefly service particularly hazardous. But for Allied tankers, the Firefly offered something that had been desperately lacking: the ability to engage German heavy armour with confidence. Lieutenant James Burt of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, who commanded a Firefly during the Normandy campaign, later wrote, "The moment you climbed into a Firefly, you went from being prey to being a hunter. Yes, the Germans targeted us first. Yes, our survival time was statistically shorter than regular Sherman crews, but we could hurt them. We could kill Tigers and Panthers that would massacre entire squadrons of normal Shermans. That psychological shift was worth every risk." The Normandy campaign in June 1944 proved the Firefly's value. German panzer divisions in Normandy were equipped with significant numbers of Panthers and Tigers, confident that their armour superiority would allow them to defeat Allied attacks. What they found instead was that every Allied tank squadron included Fireflies that could destroy even the heaviest German tanks at standard combat ranges. At Villa Bocage on June 13, 1944, a single Tiger commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann destroyed an entire British column, knocking out 14 tanks and 15 other vehicles in 15 minutes. This action became legendary in German military circles as proof of the Tiger's continued dominance. What's less often mentioned is that Wittmann's Tiger was destroyed later that same day by a Firefly of the 4th County of London Yeomanry. The crew, commanded by Sergeant Gordon, engaged Wittmann's Tiger at 800 yards, firing 3 shots. The first missed, the second struck the turret without penetrating, and the third punched through the side armour, killing Whitman and his crew instantly. This pattern repeated throughout Normandy. Tigers would achieve spectacular successes, then be destroyed by Fireflies firing from positions of concealment. The German tactical advantage was real, but no longer decisive. For every Allied tank a Tiger destroyed, there was a Firefly waiting to avenge it. The statistics from Normandy tell the story. German heavy tanks in Normandy, primarily Panthers and Tigers, destroyed Allied tanks at a ratio of approximately 5.1. But they were themselves destroyed at a rate that made these tactical victories strategically meaningless. Of the 133 Tigers deployed in Normandy, 113 were destroyed or abandoned. Panthers fared even worse, with over 400 lost. A significant percentage of these kills were attributed to Fireflies armed with 17-pounders. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out of Normandy, the 17-pounder had become standard equipment. Every British and Canadian armoured regiment included a squadron of Fireflies. Anti-tank regiments were fully equipped with towed 17-pounders. Production had finally caught up with demand, and ammunition was plentiful. The weapon that had been desperately scarce in Tunisia was now ubiquitous. German tank commanders developed a healthy respect that bordered on fear for the distinctive long-barreled Fireflies. Lieutenant Wilhelm von Rosen, a Panther commander who survived the war, recalled in 1952, "We learned to recognise the Firefly by its silhouette. That long barrel was unmistakable. When you saw one, you knew you were facing a real threat. Many commanders ordered immediate withdrawal when Fireflies were spotted. It wasn't cowardice. It was recognition that engaging a Firefly in the Panthers, despite our superior armour, was gambling with death." The evolution of ammunition further increased the 17-pounder's lethality. The original armour-piercing capped ballistic cap round was effective but not optimal. In 1944, British Ordnance introduced the armour-piercing discarding sabot round, or APDS. This revolutionary ammunition used a tungsten penetrator surrounded by a lightweight sabot that fell away after leaving the barrel. The result was a small, dense projectile travelling at over 4,000 feet per second. The penetration was extraordinary. APDS could defeat 170 metres of armour at 1,000 yards, enough to penetrate even the Tiger II's frontal armour. The Tiger II, or King Tiger, was Germany's ultimate heavy tank, weighing 70 tons with 150 mm of frontal armour. When it appeared in August 1944, German crews assumed it was invulnerable to Allied guns. They were wrong. At the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, British Fireflies demonstrated that even the King Tiger could be destroyed. Lieutenant John Gorman of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment engaged a King Tiger at 1,200 yards near Foy Notre Dame. His first APDS round struck the lower hull, penetrating and igniting ammunition. The massive German tank exploded with such force that the turret was blown 20 feet from the hull. The myth of German armour invincibility was finally and completely shattered. By late 1944, the tactical situation had reversed completely from the dark days of 1942. Now it was German tank crews who feared encountering Allied armour. The industrial advantage that had allowed Germany to field superior tanks in 1940 and 1941 had been overwhelmed by Allied production capacity and technical innovation. The 17-pounder was part of a larger pattern. While Germany had fielded technically superior individual weapons, the Allies had developed weapons that were good enough, reliable, and producible in vast quantities. The Sherman Firefly wasn't as well armoured as a Tiger, but the Allies could field 20 Fireflies for every Tiger Germany produced. The Americans took notice of the 17-pounder's success and developed their own version. The 70 Centis mm1 gun, while less powerful than the 17-pounder, offered similar performance and was easier to manufacture. By 1945, most American tank destroyers and medium tanks were equipped with 76 mm guns capable of defeating German heavy armour. The final accounting of the 17-pounder's impact is difficult to quantify precisely. British and Commonwealth forces fired approximately 1.6 million rounds of 17-pounder ammunition during the war. Each round cost about £15 to manufacture, making the total ammunition expenditure alone nearly £25 million. How many German tanks were destroyed by 17-pounders? The records are incomplete, but estimates suggest at least 1,200 confirmed kills, with perhaps 500 more probables. This doesn't sound like many compared to the total German tank losses of over 25,000, but the impact was disproportionate. Most of the Jas 200 kills were heavy tanks, Tigers, Panthers, and King Tigers that represented Germany's elite armoured forces. Each of these tanks required massive resources to produce an experienced crew to operate. When a 17-pounder destroyed a Tiger, it wasn't just eliminating one tank. It was removing a weapon system that could dominate an entire battlefield and killing a crew that had taken years to train. The psychological impact was immeasurable. German tank commanders who had operated with supreme confidence in 1942 and early 1943 became cautious, defensive, and often fatalistic by 1944. The knowledge that any Allied position might contain a gun capable of destroying their tank at ranges beyond retaliation changed German tactics fundamentally. Instead of aggressive attacks that leveraged armour superiority, German tanks increasingly fought from defensive positions, trying to ambush Allied forces rather than meeting them in open combat. This defensive mindset contributed to Germany's defeat. The 17-pounder had specific technical and tactical limitations that are worth examining. The gun's length made it awkward in confined terrain like forests or urban areas. The Firefly's distinctive profile made concealment difficult and attracted enemy fire. The APDS ammunition, while powerful, was less accurate than conventional rounds and in short supply throughout the war. Most Firefly crews carried only a few APDS rounds, relying on conventional armour-piercing ammunition for most engagements. The towed version's mobility limitations meant it was often left behind during rapid advances. Many 17-pounder positions in France and Germany were overrun simply because the guns couldn't withdraw quickly enough when German counterattacks developed. The crew's exposure to counter-battery fire and small arms made casualty rates among 17-pounder crews significantly higher than among tank crews. But these limitations were acceptable because the gun worked. It could kill Tigers. That single capability justified every drawback. In March 1945, British forces preparing to cross the Rhine received the latest intelligence assessment on German armour strength. Despite years of attrition, Germany still had approximately 1,500 tanks operational on the Western Front, including several hundred Panthers and about 60 Tigers. These numbers should have been concerning. Instead, British commanders expressed confidence. Every armoured regiment had Fireflies, every anti-tank regiment had 17-pounders, the ammunition supply was robust, the crews were experienced and well-trained. The weapon that had been desperately scarce in Tunisia 2 years earlier was now standard equipment. The Rhine crossing operations demonstrated how completely the situation had changed. German panzer units attempting to counterattack the bridgeheads were destroyed with mechanical efficiency. Fireflies and towed 17-pounders, often firing from prepared positions, engaged German armour at maximum range. The legendary German tanks that had dominated Europe in 1940 and terrorised the Eastern Front were now reduced to targets in a shooting gallery. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment, described the Rhine fighting from the German perspective. "We still had Panthers, good tanks with excellent guns, but we were fighting blind. Air superiority belonged to the Allies. We couldn't reconnoitre. We couldn't manoeuvre in daylight. When we did attack, we ran into walls of anti-tank fire from guns that could kill us at any range. The tactical advantages we had enjoyed earlier in the war were gone. We were fighting with one hand tied behind our backs, and our enemies had learned how to hurt us." By April 1945, German resistance was collapsing, not because German soldiers stopped fighting, but because they lacked the tools to fight effectively. Tank units without fuel sat immobile, infantry without support were bypassed, and the armour that did engage found itself facing weapons like the 17-pounder that had closed the technological gap. The Tiger I had entered service in August 1942 as the most formidable tank in the world. For a brief period it had been genuinely invincible, a weapon so superior to Allied equipment that conventional tactics couldn't counter it. That period lasted less than 6 months. By January 1943, the 17-pounder had demonstrated that the Tiger could be killed. By June 1944, Fireflies had made the Tiger a marked target. By 1945, the Tiger was obsolete, outranged by American 90mm guns, outgunned by Soviet 120mm guns, and hunted by British 17-pounders that could destroy it at any range. Of the 1,347 Tigers produced during the war, approximately 1,300 were destroyed or captured. Many fell to 17-pounders, in both towed and Firefly versions. The Invincible tank had become just another casualty. The 17-pounder remained in British service long after World War II. It equipped British and Commonwealth armour through the Korean War, where it proved effective against Soviet-supplied T-34 or 85 tanks. It wasn't retired from frontline service until the late 1950s, and remarkably long service life for a weapon designed in 1941. The gun's basic design influenced post-war development. The lessons learned, the importance of high-velocity guns, the value of armour-piercing sabre ammunition, the need for mobile anti-tank platforms, shaped Cold War tank design. Modern tank guns are direct descendants of weapons like the 17-pounder. In 1978, at a reunion of British and German tank veterans in London, former adversaries shared stories over drinks. A British Firefly commander from the Sherwood Rangers and a German Tiger commander from Schwerpanzerabteilung 503 discovered they had faced each other in Normandy in June 1944. The German, now a retired businessman, asked about the engagement. The British veteran described firing 3 shots at a Tiger near Caen, the first missing, the second bouncing off the turret and the third penetrating the hull. The Tiger had burned. The German was quiet for a moment, then said, "That was my tank. You killed my driver and my gunner. I barely escaped. For 30 years I've wondered about the man who shot me." He paused, then extended his hand. "You did your job well. That gun of yours, it ended our advantage. We had thought ourselves invulnerable. You taught us otherwise." The story of the 17-pounder is ultimately about how industrial capacity and engineering ingenuity can overcome tactical superiority. Germany had fielded the Tiger, a masterpiece of engineering that represented the peak of heavy tank design in 1942. It had been enough to dominate battlefields and terrorize Allied forces, but technological advantage is only temporary. Once the Allies understood the threat and developed a counter, Germany's advantage disappeared. The 17-pounder was that counter. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy to manufacture. It wasn't as elegant as some later designs. But it worked when it mattered most, killing Tigers when Tigers needed to be killed. That single capability changed armoured warfare forever. On January 18, 1943, Lieutenant John Foote and his crew fired the shot that killed a Tiger and killed the myth of German armour invincibility. In the years that followed, thousands of 17-pounder crews repeated that performance, destroying German heavy tanks and proving that no weapon is invulnerable, no advantage permanent. The day the Tiger met the British 17-pounder was the day everything changed. The hunter became the hunted, the invincible became vulnerable, the laughter stopped, and the thunder of that 17-pound shell echoing across Tunisia announced that the Allies had entered the armoured warfare game with a weapon that could match Germany's best. The technical achievement represented by the 17-pounder is worth examining in detail because it illustrates how quickly military technology evolved under wartime pressure. In 1939, the standard British anti-tank gun was the 2-pounder. Firing a 40mm shell weighing just over 2 pounds, it could penetrate 42 wheelletters of armour at 500 yards, adequate against the tanks of 1939. By 1943, just 4 years later, the British were fielding a gun that could penetrate 3 times as much armour at twice the range. That rate of technological advancement was unprecedented in military history. The engineering challenges were immense. Creating a gun that could accelerate a 17-pound projectile to nearly 3,000 feet per second required solving problems in metallurgy, ballistics, and mechanical engineering that pushed the boundaries of 1940s technology. The barrel had to withstand chamber pressures exceeding 20 tons per square inch without deforming or rupturing. The recoil mechanism had to absorb and dissipate the tremendous energy generated by each shot. The ammunition had to be manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch to ensure reliable feeding and consistent ballistic performance. British engineers solved these problems through a combination of innovation and brute force engineering. The barrel was manufactured from high-quality steel using a process called auto-frettage, where the barrel was deliberately overpressured during manufacturing to create compressive stresses in the metal that increased its strength. The recoil mechanism used a sophisticated hydropneumatic system that absorbed recoil energy progressively, preventing the violent kickback that would have made the gun uncontrollable. The ammunition manufacturing process involved multiple quality control steps that rejected any round not meeting specifications. The result was a weapon system that was reliable, accurate, and devastatingly effective. Field reports consistently praised the 17-pounder's performance. Guns that had fired thousands of rounds showed minimal wear. Ammunition that had been stored in harsh conditions, from the deserts of North Africa to the winter snows of northwest Europe, functioned reliably. The mechanical systems rarely failed, even under the stress of sustained combat. This reliability was critical because it meant crews could trust their weapon. A tank crew facing a Tiger knew that if they could get their gun on target, it would fire when they pulled the trigger, and the shell would perform as designed. That confidence translated into tactical effectiveness. Crews that trust their equipment fight more aggressively and more effectively than those who doubt their weapons. The ammunition diversity also deserves attention. Beyond the standard armor-piercing rounds, 17-pounders could fire high-explosive shells for use against soft targets, smoke rounds for screening movements, and later in the war, the revolutionary APDS ammunition. This versatility made the 17-pounder useful across a wide range of tactical situations. A Firefly could engage enemy armor with armor-piercing rounds, then switch to high explosive to suppress anti-tank guns or destroy infantry positions. The high explosive capability was particularly valuable in the close terrain of Normandy's Bocage country. When Fireflies weren't hunting German armor, they provided direct fire support for infantry, destroying bunkers and strongpoints with their powerful HE shells. The 17-pounder's HE round, while not as large as a tank destroyer's, was sufficient to destroy buildings, detonate ammunition dumps, and create breaches in walls. This multi-role capability made Fireflies more valuable than specialized tank destroyers that could only fight other tanks. Training crews to use the 17-pounder effectively took time and resources. The gun's characteristics were different enough from earlier weapons that experienced anti-tank crews needed retraining. The higher velocity meant different ballistic calculations. The longer range meant different engagement tactics. The heavier ammunition required different physical handling procedures. British training programs evolved rapidly to meet these needs. By late 1943, dedicated 17-pounder training schools were operating in England, putting crews through intensive courses that included classroom instruction on ballistics and tactics, extensive live fire practice, and realistic combat simulations. Crews arriving in combat units were expected to be able to engage targets at 1,000 yards with first-round hits, and to be able to service and maintain their weapons under field conditions. The emphasis on marksmanship paid dividends. British and Commonwealth 17-pounder crews consistently achieved higher hit rates than their German counterparts, despite often engaging at longer ranges. This superior accuracy reflected both better training and better equipment. The 17-pounder's sights were excellent, using high-quality optics that provided clear target acquisition even in poor visibility. The gun's inherent accuracy, combined with well-trained crews, made it a precision instrument. German respect for the 17-pounder grew throughout 1944 and 1945. Captured German documents revealed detailed studies of the weapon's capabilities and numerous tactical bulletins warning about its threat. One intelligence summary from Panzer Lehr Division in July 1944 described the Firefly as the most dangerous Allied armoured vehicle and instructed commanders to identify and destroy Fireflies before engaging other targets. This German focus on eliminating Fireflies first created a grim calculus for Allied armour commanders. Fireflies were essential for dealing with German heavy tanks, but they were also more likely to be destroyed in any engagement. The solution was to try to disguise Fireflies to blend in with regular Shermans. Crews painted their distinctive long barrels to make them less obvious, added false muzzle brakes to regular Shermans to confuse German observers, and employed Fireflies in positions where their silhouettes wouldn't stand out. These camouflage efforts had mixed success. Experienced German tank commanders could usually identify Fireflies by subtle differences in appearance, and the distinctive report of the 17-pounder gun when it fired immediately revealed a Firefly's position. But even marginal improvements in survivability were worthwhile given the Firefly's tactical importance. The casualty rates tell the story. Firefly crews in northwest Europe had a survival rate approximately 15% lower than regular Sherman crews. but those crews accepted the risk because they understood their importance. Sergeant Jack Wardrop of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, who commanded a Firefly from D-Day to VE Day, one of the rare few to survive the entire campaign, later reflected on this reality. "We knew we were marked men. Every German tank commander was hunting for Fireflies. We stood out, we were priority targets, and our chances weren't good. But someone had to do it. Someone had to be able to stop the Tigers and Panthers. If we didn't, they'd slaughter the regular Shermans and then kill the infantry. So we took the risk, we did the job, and we lost a lot of good men doing it." The tactical evolution of Firefly employment shows how commanders learn to maximize the weapon's effectiveness while minimizing its vulnerabilities. Early in the Normandy campaign, Fireflies were often distributed individually, one per troop of 4 tanks. This provided every unit with anti-armor capability, but made Fireflies easier to identify and isolate. By August 1944, many units had shifted to concentrating Fireflies in dedicated troops or even squadrons. This concentration of firepower allowed Fireflies to support each other and created killing zones that German armour couldn't penetrate. When 3 or 4 Fireflies could position themselves to create overlapping fields of fire, any German tank entering that zone faced multiple 17-pounder guns simultaneously. Even Tigers couldn't survive that kind of focused fire. The towed 17-pounder units developed their own tactical innovations. Recognizing that the gun's size made it difficult to conceal, crews developed elaborate camouflage techniques. Guns would be positioned well before an expected engagement, with days spent creating natural-looking concealment that would withstand scrutiny even from close range. Dummy positions would be created to draw enemy fire away from real guns. One particularly successful technique was the ambush line, where multiple 17-pounders would be positioned in depth along a likely German avenue of approach. The first gun would be positioned to fire at extreme range, perhaps 800 or 2,000 yards. If German tanks survived the first engagement and continued forward, they would run into a second gun at 200 yards, then a third at 800 yards. This layered defence forced German armour to run a gauntlet, where they were always under fire from at least one 17-pounder. At the Battle of Arnhem in September 1944, British airborne forces discovered a painful lesson about the importance of heavy anti-tank weapons. The 1st Airborne Division, dropped to capture bridges across the Rhine, had only 6-pounder anti-tank guns, which could be delivered by glider. When German SS Panzer divisions counterattacked with Panthers and Tigers, the British airborne troops found themselves helpless against the German armour. Captain Tony Frank of the 2nd Parachute Battalion later described the hopelessness of the situation. "We hit them with everything we had, 6-pounders, Piats, even small arms fire out of desperation. Nothing worked. The Panthers drove through our positions like we weren't there. Men died trying to get close enough to use gammon bombs and sticky grenades. We needed 17-pounders. We needed Fireflies. We had neither, and we paid for that with blood." The Arnhem experience reinforced the lesson that airborne and light infantry needed man-portable weapons capable of defeating heavy armour. This led to the development of more effective infantry anti-tank weapons in the war's final months, but it also highlighted how critical the 17-pounder had become to Allied tactical doctrine. Whenever possible, ground operations included 17-pounders in the force structure specifically to counter German heavy tanks. The logistical challenge of supporting 17-pounders in combat is often overlooked but was substantial. Each gun required a constant supply of ammunition, and the 17-pound shells were heavy and bulky. A single truck could carry only about 100 rounds, enough to sustain a single gun through one intense engagement or several smaller actions. Keeping frontline units supplied required a sophisticated logistics chain moving thousands of tons of ammunition forward daily. The ammunition itself was expensive and time-consuming to produce. Each shell required high-quality steel for the penetrator, precisely manufactured driving bands to engage the barrels rifling, and explosive fillers for the armour-piercing incendiary variants. Quality control was critical because a defective round could jam the gun, or worse, explode in the barrel, killing the crew. British industry rose to the challenge. By 1944, ammunition production had reached levels that ensured frontline units never faced critical shortages. The Lake City Arsenal in the United States also produced 17-pounder ammunition under license, supplementing British production. By the war's end, stockpiles of 17-pounder ammunition in Europe exceeded 2 million rounds, enough to sustain intensive combat operations indefinitely. The financial cost was staggering. Each 17-pounder gun cost approximately £2,000 to manufacture in 1944, equivalent to perhaps £100,000 today. Britain produced over 10,000 guns during the war, for a total cost exceeding £20 million for the guns alone. Add ammunition, training, spare parts and support equipment, and the total program cost exceeded £100 million, an enormous sum for a nation whose entire war budget was stretched to the breaking point. Yet, it was money well spent. The 17-pounder gave British and Commonwealth forces a weapon that could defeat German armour, preventing the tactical stalemates that could have prolonged the war. Every Tiger destroyed by a 17-pounder was one less obstacle to Allied advance. Every German counterattack stopped by Fireflies was one more step toward victory. The psychological dimensions of the 17-pounder's impact extended beyond the battlefield. For British soldiers who had endured years of setbacks, from Dunkirk through the North African campaigns, finally having a weapon that could match German technology was profoundly important for morale. The constant refrain of "German tanks are better" had been demoralising. The 17-pounder changed that narrative. Lieutenant James Campbell of the 144th Regiment, Royal Armoured Corps, described this psychological shift in his wartime diary. June 12, 1944. Today we received our first Firefly. The crew gathered around it like children with a new toy. Tommy, our loader, patted the barrel like it was a pet. "Finally," he said, "we can hit back. That's what it feels like. For so long, we've been afraid of Tigers, Panthers, all the German heavies. Now we have a weapon that makes them afraid of us. It changes everything." This confidence translated into tactical aggressiveness. Units equipped with Fireflies and 17-pounders were more willing to engage German armour, more likely to hold positions when attacked, and more effective in offensive operations. The psychological advantage that German tank crews had enjoyed since 1940 had shifted to the Allies by late 1944. The Germans felt this shift acutely. Morale reports from German panzer divisions in late 1944 and early 1945 consistently mentioned declining confidence and increasing casualties. Experienced crews who had survived years of combat were being killed by Allied weapons they couldn't counter. New crews arriving as replacements lasted only days or weeks before being destroyed. Obergefreiter Klaus Müller, a Panther loader who was wounded in February 1945 and captured, was interrogated about German tank crew morale. His statement, preserved in Allied intelligence files, is revealing. "We knew we were losing, not because our tanks were bad, the Panther is a good tank, but because there were too many enemies and too few of us. Every time we moved, Jabos attacked from the air. Every time we engaged Allied tanks, their Fireflies destroyed us. We couldn't win, we could only die more slowly." This demoralisation accelerated Germany's collapse. Tank crews who don't believe in victory don't fight as effectively as those who do. The certainty of defeat, combined with the knowledge that Allied weapons like the 17-pounder could kill them at any range, made German tank crews cautious and defensive when aggressiveness was needed. The 17-pounder's influence extended into the post-war period in unexpected ways. When Britain and other NATO nations began planning for potential conflict with the Soviet Union, the lessons learned from 17-pounder employment shaped anti-tank doctrine. The Soviets had large numbers of heavy tanks, including the IS-2 and IS-3, with armour comparable to the German Tigers. NATO planners knew that any defensive strategy against Soviet armour had to include weapons capable of defeating these heavies. The British developed the 20-pounder gun as a successor to the 17-pounder, then the famous 105mm L7 gun that armed British, American, German and many other NATO tanks for decades. These weapons were direct descendants of the 17-pounder, incorporating lessons learned about the importance of high-velocity, armour-piercing ammunition and accurate fire control systems. The Soviet Union, having faced German APDS emitter guns on the Eastern Front and learning through intelligence about the 17-pounder's capabilities, developed their own high-velocity tank guns. The 100mm D10T and later the 150mm U5TS were Soviet attempts to match the anti-armour capabilities that the 17-pounder had demonstrated. The arms race in tank gun technology that dominated the Cold War had its roots in the World War II experience of weapons like the 17-pounder proving that gun technology could overcome armour protection. Interestingly, the United States Army, despite having access to 17-pounder technology and combat data, chose to develop its own separate line of tank guns. The 70-Sekundig Mil M1 gun, while less powerful than the 17-pounder, was easier to manufacture and used ammunition that was already in American supply chains. The later 90mm gun, introduced in the M26 Pershing tank in 1945, offered performance closer to the 17-pounder. This American decision reflected different industrial and tactical priorities. The US had the manufacturing capacity to produce large numbers of Sherman tanks armed with adequate guns, rather than smaller numbers of tanks with superior guns. American tactical doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower through numbers rather than technical superiority in individual weapons. The approach worked, though it resulted in higher American tank losses than British and Commonwealth forces faced with their Fireflies. The debate over whether the American approach of quantity or the British approach of quality was superior continued throughout the Cold War. Both approaches had merit. The American strategy ensured that sufficient armour was available for large-scale operations. The British strategy ensured that available armour could engage enemy heavies effectively. The ideal would have been to combine both approaches, producing large numbers of highly capable tanks, but wartime resource constraints made such an ideal impossible for either nation. By 1946, with the war over and the world entering a new era, the 17-pounder's active combat service was essentially finished. Guns remained in service, but they were no longer fighting. The weapon that had been desperately needed in 1943 was now obsolete, surpassed by more powerful weapons designed for a potential future conflict. This rapid obsolescence was characteristic of World War II weapon development, where the pace of innovation made even recent designs outdated within years or even months. Yet the 17-pounder's legacy endured. Veterans who had served 17-pounder guns or crude Fireflies carried memories of the weapon throughout their lives. Reunions of tank regiments and artillery units featured 17-pounders prominently in their memorabilia and stories. The gun had earned a place in military history as the weapon that ended German armour superiority. Museums today preserve numerous examples of 17-pounders, both towed versions and Fireflies. The Imperial War Museum in London has a pristine Firefly on display, its long 17-pounder barrel extending menacingly forward. The Bovington Tank Museum has multiple examples, including one Firefly that saw action in Normandy and bears the scars of German return fire. These preserved weapons serve as reminders of the technological and industrial achievement they represented. Modern visitors to these museums often express surprise at the 17-pounder's size. Photographs don't adequately convey the weapon's bulk or the length of its barrel. Standing next to a 17-pounder gun provides a physical sense of the engineering challenges British designers overcame and the difficulties crews faced in handling such a massive weapon system under combat conditions. The human stories remain the most compelling aspect of the 17-pounder's history. Behind the statistics of penetration values and kill ratios were thousands of young men who served these guns under conditions of extreme danger. Many died in action, killed by German tank fire, artillery or infantry attacks. Many more were wounded, suffering injuries that affected them for the rest of their lives. But they did their jobs, manning their guns, engaging German armour, and contributing to Allied victory. Sergeant William Anderson of the 62nd Anti-Tank Regiment died on August 12, 1944, near Falaise, France. His 17-pounder had destroyed 2 Panthers that morning, protecting a British infantry advance. Then a German artillery barrage caught his position, killing Anderson and wounding 3 of his crew. He was 23 years old. His name appears on a memorial in Normandy, one of thousands who died in the campaign. His contribution was typical of 17-pounder crews, effective, essential, and ultimately fatal. The families of these men carried their own burdens. Wives became widows, children lost fathers, parents buried sons. The telegram beginning, "The War Office regrets to inform you," arrived at thousands of British homes during the war years, each one carrying news that shattered a family. Behind every successful 17-pounder engagement that destroyed a German tank was the risk that the gun's crew might not survive the action. Yet volunteers kept coming. Even as casualty lists grew, young men continued to join anti-tank regiments and volunteer for Firefly service. Some were motivated by patriotism, others by a desire for adventure, many simply by a sense of duty. They trained on the 17-pounder, learned its capabilities and limitations, and went forward to face German armour. Their courage and skill made the weapon effective. The technical specifications of the 17-pounder are worth summarising for those interested in the engineering details. The gun fired a 76.2mm shell weighing 17 pounds at a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. The barrel was 55 calibers long, meaning 55 times the bore diameter, or about 14 feet. The recoil mechanism could absorb the tremendous recoil energy, allowing the gun to be fired repeatedly without excessive wear. The effective range for armour penetration was approximately 2,000 yards, with maximum range exceeding 10,000 yards when firing high explosive shells. The standard armour-piercing shell could penetrate 130mm of armour at 1,000 yards when striking at a 90-degree angle. Against sloped armour, penetration decreased, but the 17-pounder retained effectiveness against most German tanks, even when striking at unfavourable angles. The armour-piercing discarding sabot ammunition, introduced in 1944, could penetrate 170 mm at 1,000 yards, making it effective against even the heaviest German armour. The gun weighed 3,868 pounds in its field carriage version, requiring a substantial towing vehicle, typically a truck or tracked carrier. The gun could be brought into action by a trained crew in about 2 minutes, faster in emergencies. The rate of fire was approximately 10 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, though sustained fire rates were lower due to crew fatigue and ammunition handling limitations. These dry specifications don't convey the reality of operating the weapon. The noise was tremendous, each shot producing a sound that could be heard for miles. The recoil, even with the sophisticated recoil mechanism, was violent enough to shake the ground and throw up clouds of dust. The muzzle blast could damage nearby structures and vegetation. Crews firing the gun wore hearing protection, though the technology of the 1940s meant that most 17-pounder veterans suffered some degree of hearing loss. The physical demands on the crew were substantial. The loader had to handle 17-pound shells plus their cartridge cases, each weighing nearly 30 pounds together, and maintain a rate of fire that kept the gun effective in combat. This required considerable strength and endurance. After an extended engagement, loaders were often exhausted, their arms trembling from the effort of repeatedly lifting and loading the heavy ammunition. The gun layer, responsible for aiming and firing, needed excellent eyesight and steady nerves. Engaging targets at 1,000 yards or more required precise aim, accounting for range, target motion, wind, and temperature. The best gun layers could consistently hit targets on the first shot, a skill that came from hundreds of hours of practice and natural aptitude. These men were the marksmen of the anti-tank regiments, and their skills directly determined how effective their guns would be. The gun commander had perhaps the most demanding job, responsible for target acquisition, range estimation, tactical positioning, and crew coordination. A good commander could make an average crew highly effective. A poor commander could waste even the best crew's potential. The most successful 17-pounder guns were inevitably those with experienced, capable commanders who understood both the weapon's capabilities and the tactical situations in which it was employed. The evolution of German tactics in response to the 17-pounder provides insight into how military forces adapt to new threats. Initially, German tank commanders didn't recognize the 17-pounder as a distinct threat. They engaged Allied anti-tank positions using the same tactics that had worked against 6-pounders and 57mm guns, closing to within 1,000 yards before opening fire. This approach proved fatal when the positions contained 17-pounders that could engage effectively at much longer ranges. By mid-1944, German tactical doctrine had evolved to emphasize longer-range engagements and more careful reconnaissance. Tiger and Panther commanders were instructed to identify anti-tank gun positions before closing and to engage from maximum range whenever possible. This caution reduced German losses but also reduced German effectiveness, as long-range engagements reduced hit probabilities and allowed Allied forces to maneuver more freely. The ultimate German tactical response was simply to avoid engaging when Fireflies or towed 17-pounders were known to be present. Several instances exist in combat records where German army units withdrew rather than face positions known to contain 17-pounders, even when tactical objectives required attack. This psychological dominance was precisely what the Allies needed. Weapons that enemy forces fear and avoid are effective even when not firing. As we examine the 17-pounder's place in military history, it's important to recognise that no single weapon wins wars. The 17-pounder was one component of a vast Allied military machine that included air power, infantry, artillery, logistics, and industrial production. Its importance lay in solving a specific problem, the threat of German heavy tanks that could have stalled Allied advances and prolonged the war. Without effective anti-tank weapons, Allied forces would have struggled to advance against German armour. The 6-pounder and 57 mm guns were inadequate. American 75 mm and 77 guns were better, but still marginal against the heaviest German tanks. The 17-pounder provided Allied forces with confidence that they could defeat any German tank they encountered. That confidence translated into tactical aggressiveness that kept German forces on the defensive. The final word on the 17-pounder perhaps belongs to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding British ground forces in northwest Europe. In a post-war interview, Montgomery was asked about the weapons that had been most critical to Allied victory. He mentioned air power, artillery, and then specifically the 17-pounder. The 17-pounder gave us the ability to stand up to German armour. Before we had it in quantity, we had to be clever, had to outmaneuver them, had to hope for the best. Once we had it, we could meet them head-on and win. That changed everything. It meant we could attack when and where we chose, knowing that if German tanks counterattacked, we could stop them. You cannot overstate how important that was to our victory. On January 18th, 1943, when Lieutenant Foote's crew destroyed that Tiger near Buerada, they couldn't have known how significant that moment would prove. They had simply done their job, engaged a target, and fired their weapon. But that single shot announced to both sides that the balance of armoured warfare had shifted. The Tiger could be killed. German armour superiority was not permanent. Allied industry and engineering had produced a weapon capable of defeating Germany's best. The thunder of that 17-pounder shot echoed across battlefields from Tunisia to Germany, from Normandy to the Rhine. Every Tiger destroyed, every Panther knocked out, every German counterattack stopped by Fireflies or towed 17-pounders proved the same point. Technical advantage is temporary. Industrial capacity matters. And in a war of production, the side that can design, manufacture and deploy effective weapons faster will ultimately prevail. The day the Tiger I met the British 17-pounder was the day German armour supremacy died. The invincible had been defeated, the unstoppable had been stopped, and the war moved one step closer to its inevitable end. The 17-pounder had spoken, and the battlefield would never be the same.